We'll probably wait about one more minute. This is where I wish I had some elevator music. I think there's one more person getting in. Hey, Eric, I just sent you a new link. All right, sounds good. All right, bye. All right, perfect. Nope, nope, sounds good. All right, bye. All right, perfect. So I think we got what we call a quorum here. So welcome everyone, and I'll continue to admit people as they come in, but I don't want to hold up. We start at noon. I like to be punctual. So I'm glad to have everyone here in our kind of first informal luncheon in regards to the COVID credits. And the reason why I feel that it's also still important is I think there's also going to be the pressure mounting as well that this credit gets extended sometime for 2021. As it is something that's set to expire in the end of 2020. But that doesn't change the fact that there's still people with, especially these outbursts of COVID cases going across Wisconsin in particular. It's now become very relevant to a lot of employers, as far as what to do, how to handle situations, and we've had a fair amount of questions in relation to this. So I'm glad to have you here. So we're going to go through some of the basics of what this is and some frequently asked questions. So feel free to comment, and this is informal. So if you want to use the chat, feel free to chat. If you want to pop on and unmute your mic, just kind of pop on, introduce yourself, and we will we'll continue. But this is meant to as a value-added service for Hortonist, as we're trying to get more people to understand why this is important, because we also feel that this is a credit issue that people might be missing on their tax returns, especially if you're self-employed. So without further ado, we're going to make you aware of the credits and discuss some various frequently asked questions we've gotten from various clients of ours to help you understand these credits a lot more here. And where these credits come from is from the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, or what's called the FFCRA. Everyone should be able to see my screen. You should be able to see the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. So if you're not seeing it, send a chat or just pop in and say, hey, hold on a minute. It produces the backbone of the credit here. And what it's meant to do is expand the Family Medical Leave Act for a lot of small employers. So for those under 500 employees, we're all subject to this. Now, keep in mind a couple things, that there is a potential exception for the daycare. I will talk about a few situations about how the credit kicks in. There are a few exceptions for those under 50. There's a screen slightly covered by another one. Oh, thank you for letting me know so I can pull that out. Thank you, Angel. So there is an expansion of the FMLA, and we're all subject to it. And there is an exception for daycare closures or school closures where under 50 employees, if you feel that it's producing a going concern issue, which accounting talk means that it's going to risk your business essentially by offering this, then you could potentially opt out of a couple provisions, but not all. So for all intents and purposes, we're going to assume that people are covered by this, because really what we're going to be driving at here is mostly the sick pay element of it. So, so qualifying circumstances include first off, when the employee's sick. Now, they could show up to work with a cough or a fever, and you could send them home. And actually, prior to now, it was probably frowned upon or even potentially illegal to have people take temperature checks to come into work. But in light of the circumstances now, that's actually an okayed procedure under the Department of Labor to if you need to temperature check people before they start their shift. So the employee technically need not be sick themselves. They could also, I would also put in there as a note, quarantined, because if they're quarantined because they were exposed, and the doctor governed, and remember that has to be imposed by the government, which could be the health department or a doctor. Them self-imposing a quarantine is not sufficient. I can't say I think I might have COVID exposed, but that's not going to fly. It has to be imposed on you, not self-quarantine because you want to be safe. So in order for this to kick in. So essentially the first part is the employee sick or are they quarantined? In which case they can get 100% of their pay up to 2 weeks. It's called the EPSL or expanded paid sick leave. And with that, so if they're paid, for example, $10 an hour for 40 hours a week, that's 400, that's $400 a week. They could continue, or I should say, 40 hours, we got $400 a week. They can continue to get that for up to 2 weeks, assuming they're full time. If they're part-time, that amount gets pro-rata, reduced down. We had a situation where someone worked 30 hours a week, so they're not eligible for the full 80 hours. It's based off of 60 in that case because that's their average their working time on average for part-time. Now, bear in mind that these 2 weeks need not be concurrent. So if they're quarantined for 1 week and then the doctor gives the okay to say because symptoms stop, and they can go back next week and they're cured, or let's say it was a false alarm, because you could still fall under the sick pay provision even if you don't have COVID, because the doctor or health department said you have to quarantine because you're exposed. They go get a test, so they're stuck at home. So it doesn't need to be concurrent. You can have 1 week and then a week later, but it's a maximum of 80 hours, based on full time. You also have the potential where you have family sick. So let's say a kid is sick or a kid's exposed and and the kid's quarantined and the parent has to stay home with the child. That also falls under the EPSL, but they don't get 100% for that. They get 2/3. So in the situation where I described for the $10 an hour times 40, it would be 2/3 is the maximum they're allowed to get for that. And the reason why I say this is that we as employers are required to offer this. And there's a corresponding tax credit, so that way it's no cost to the employer, because you get reimbursed for both you get a credit for the wage as well as to make sure you're not subject to the Social Security tax element on it either. So it really shouldn't be a extra cost to the employer by doing this. The cost really is that you don't have people that are working with, doing the work. And then, of course, there's the school daycare closure as well. And that can be up to 10 weeks paid at 2/3, and it can be supplemented with the sick pay before up there too. Again, that's that's an extreme situation, but that is there as well. And essentially, it's an expansion of the Family Medical Leave Act, or FMLA, hence the EFMLA. And the reason why it's important is because it gets really confusing at which one qualifies or which one kicks in. There's a lot of flow charts out there that, one in particular that I love that I found from a law firm was one here. And, and I kind of showed this to a couple people already. But, so like when does it kick in under the EFMLA or EPSL? It's a pretty complex flow chart, but it makes sense. Which starts with who's initiating, I'm not coming to work. For example, I love it. It says, this one here says employees scared of contracting COVID and refuses to come to work. Sorry, no dice. You're not getting sick pay for that. At that point, you follow your normal procedures for absences as an employer. Is it excused or unexcused? And from there, you go further. So, so that's an important thing to keep in mind is as employers, we may face that. Someone says, I'm scared, I don't want to get sick. Well, at that point, I had one that was a bar restaurant, and the bartender said, "I'm not coming in. I'm scared to get sick. I want my sick pay." And the answer was no dice. You essentially that's equivalent to a voluntary resignation, what you just gave there, saying you're not coming in. So in that case too, they could also risk their unemployment. And that's one thing I will say is be careful as employers as far as advising on unemployment. You're not an unemployment attorney. You're not the government. You can give them some guidance, a little bit to a degree, but ultimately you have to tell them that's between you and unemployment. So I don't want you to get tripped up in that because, obviously you're looking at, so it's it can be a lot of different situations. I am curious though, for what have all of you been doing? You can chat or chime in if you want and just say hello. What have you been doing considering this so far? Have you been doing this or have you been unsure? Is there something you're like, did I do this right? You can always type it in. I can keep it anonymous, in the chat, use the chat feature if you want to type it in. But I'm curious to know what you have been doing because, and realistically, no one really talked about this as much until fairly recently because, again, now we're exploding with all these COVID cases across Wisconsin. So now it's, even though this law has been in action since effectively April, it's gathering a lot of steam now because of the explosion of cases we're having. So the calculation itself, and feel free to interject anyone, it's 2 weeks, and I discussed this already here. It's a max of 80 hours, and it's reduced pro rata if they're part-time. And so the EPSL, there is a max of $511 per day. So you're not going to be able to pay an executive who makes $500,000 a year, replace their entire wage if they're sick. There is a limit on the daily amount. So doing the math there as far as days go, it's still a pretty hefty amount, so it covers a lot of workers, but I just wanted to point out that there is a limit to it. There's also a limit if you're under the 2/3 pay as well, which is max 200 a day. And it's again, further reduced if part-time. So good question out there. Does it apply to minor employees as well as adult employees? Great question. The key is that they work for you for 30 days. That's it. So it's a very low threshold. So it can be pulled in. Now keep in mind the part-time, it has to be for their scheduled, if they're missing their scheduled work. So it's not like a freebie there. So it is a loose guideline. They don't have a high threshold to meet in order for workers to be subject to this. So great question there. And now another thing I wanted to point out too is normally in a lot of circumstances, and normally in a lot of circumstances, you have situations where, the employer or the self-employed person doesn't get the credit. It's always benefiting of the employee, which, it's how the law is. But this is unique in the sense that this credit also applies to the self-employed. So if you yourself, as the self-employed owner, if you yourself is sick from COVID or quarantined to it, you can actually draw your own sick pay because of it and claim a credit. In fact, for the self-employed who are not on a wage, it's actually a specific calculation. That's right. This is right from the IRS. The example I came up with, but it's based off your average daily self-employment, which is essentially your self-employment earnings for 2020 divided by 260 days. So like, let's say a self-employed sole proprietor is sick or someone who earns self-employment income. Let's say they have $100,000 in 2020, divide that by 260. And so the days they're quarantined or sick, they'd get a credit on their 1040 for the $384.62 a day. It'll be rounded, of course. The point is that I foresee this as a potential miss on a lot of tax returns out there, because normally these kind of juicy benefits are only catered to help employees, but also targeted for self-employed as well. And there's very, quite frankly, I'd anticipate that maybe some owners might have already forgotten to pay themselves their own sick pay and are leaving credits on the table. Now, I do want to point out that documentation, documentation, documentation. As with anything with the government, if there's a carrot, you better believe that there's a lot of red tape for that carrot. So you really do need to keep documents. You need a signed form by the employee is my recommendation, and a doctor, government health department note advising you quarantine. Because if you, as the employer, are audited and the credit comes into question, they're allowed to say what documentation did you rely upon to determine that it is eligible sick pay, and in which case you need this documentation. And if you don't have it, then they can disallow the credit and make you repay the credit you got from the IRS. The first step I would recommend is, and I got this from the tax association that I'm a part of, is a request relief form here. Can you just, if anyone can just comment, make sure, because I'm still getting used to Zoom, the sharing screen feature. If you can just comment, say, yep, I can see a document of the Families First Coronavirus Relief Form, because I don't want to kind of go through it and then it's, you're just staring at a slide. Perfect. Thank you, Angela. I see it. So this is, the kind of the recommendation, that you have something in writing from the employee. And of course, I mean, they're probably at home, and I wouldn't recommend rushing and breaking down their door to give them this form to say, before I pay you, but they do need to give you something on the back end that they're attesting to you that yes, this it is, and I understand I will be required to provide appropriate documentation. Because can you imagine, and some employees might say, nah, I don't want to give that to you. Well, if it's an issue, then there probably is an issue, if you catch my drift. Like we had someone who, where the employer asked, they said, oh, my person says they're sick with COVID and they want their sick pay. And I said, great, get the documentation for it. And the guy called, he called him up and said, well, my accountant said, that's okay, you can always blame me. So he said, I got tread marks on my back, feel free to blame the accountant. I say, my accountant needs that form. I need documentation to prove that you got a test and you did this. And lo and behold, he all of a sudden he was better and showed up to work the next day. So you could probably guess, and then essentially his response was, oh, it was a scare, my mistake. So, you can probably imagine the abuse with that. And I'm more than happy to share this with those. If you want me to share a document, just, shoot me an email or just let me know in chat. I can be more than happy to share this. But it's something that I do think would be helpful because, again, you have to prove as the employer that you did your due diligence in verifying the accuracy of this. So great question that the employer said, we have been instructed by the city of Appleton that an employee who worked with an employee who tested positive cannot work for 14 days. Okay, how do we handle that? The city, AKA a government agency, that's the key point. The government agency says they're quarantined. So in that case, they would fall under this provision because they are quarantined by a government agency. That's the whole purpose of this law. And so then essentially if they're a part-time worker, and if they're a part-time worker, because in this particular case, I kind of imagine that they probably work maybe 15 to 20 hours a week, or give or take. But if that's the case, they're not going to get 80 hours for free. They're only going to get their average part-time work. So it's not like they're going to get, a whole big, big giant bonus check for being quarantined. And as an aside, I am aware that people probably do try to abuse this. What documentation would I suggest filed with verbal instruction? So that's a great question. What documentation? So what I would say there is the documentation is that you need something from the Health and Human Services Department that would state that. I have actually seen a letter that if they ask for it, they'll get it. So then my response is if they're saying verbally, I'm quarantined. All right, great. If you want your sick pay, I need a document. they're not giving documents. In that case, I call baloney because I have personally seen documents from the health department instructing someone to stay home because of exposure. They just have to ask for it. But the thing is, if there's no document for it, then at that point, I would say, then we're going to follow the normal protocol for not showing up to work. And it's the, because without that, I mean, you can claim anything, of course, but in the law itself and per IRS and per Department of Labor, they all say that the employer is required to and will ask for documentation. So this should be of no surprise to anyone. I mean, I say that loosely because, obviously it might be, this whole thing is a surprise to everybody, but just be kind about it and say, and again, you could always blame your accountants, or just say, ultimately the Department of Labor, and IRS, they require me to get this. They will give it to you if you ask. It could be from the doctor, it could be from the city of Appleton, or you can just talk to the city of Appleton there. And in your case, if the city of Appleton tells me that they need to stay home, then get something from the city of Appleton. That the government, is saying that that you're requiring you to keep those people home there. So they should be obliged to provide that. Now it might take a while because since it's exploding everywhere, but just keep pressing them to get something in writing. So, and then from a liability perspective, I would.
No, it's already cut.
Okay. From a liability perspective, I would say to consider getting a clearance note from the doctor if they are sick, just to prove that yes, they're cleared to come back to work. Because one thing you don't want to be caught in problem with is that you're being callous or disregarding human life, because we do have an obligation as an employer to provide a safe work environment. So you don't want to, I heard of someone telling me one time that a worker said, I think I might have COVID, I was exposed, I'm showing symptoms, and the employer said, that's okay, just come in and wear a mask. That is a callous disregard for safety of others, and that can cause a problem. Also keep in mind, since we're dealing with medical documentation, you want to keep this secure in a file here. When it comes to medical provisions, we do have to be careful on sharing that information. I was talking to someone that technically you can't really say if there's a COVID exposure, you can't technically say who had it. You have to say there was an exposure at the workplace. Now, in a small business sense, you could probably figure out, when someone's not showing up to work all of a sudden, you could probably figure out who's the one that was the exposed person. So, but, you have to be careful that you're not just willy-nilly giving out the medical information about employees, because that can be a potential violation of the American Disabilities Act, as well as the potential violation of HIPAA, where we're required to keep medical information confidential. So keep it in their employee file and just don't share it with anyone other than those authorized by the company to handle those sensitive matters. So some frequently asked questions that we've gotten is, what if my employee doesn't give me documentation? If they don't give you documentation, or if they're refusing to give it to you, and it could be I can't do it, and this is something I've done, I've always instructed, and I said, well, just simply tell them I need the documentation. You are supposed to be able to get it if you ask. You can fax it this here or there. I have, and now obviously I can't really show you a document that I have gotten, because that would be in violation of the previous slide, right? But they do hand out letters saying, we quarantine and until this date. So it is there. What if my employee is scared to come to work, but they're not sick or exposed? Well, the law just simply doesn't provide sick pay or even potentially unemployment for that. Even the unemployment FAQs on the Department of Workforce Development say that if you're self-quarantining because you're scared to go to work, effectively they may view that as a voluntary resignation, in which case you don't qualify. Again, I'm careful about going down that route with employees, because the moment you tell them you can't do that, they're going to say, oh, you bet, you watch me, and it takes it as a challenge. But can my employee claim unemployment if they're quarantined? Question we've gotten, and that's a maybe. And the reason why I say maybe is that, if, for example, they're not covered by sick pay, let's say you've exhausted the 2 weeks. Because first they look to, are you offered sick pay? And if you get sick pay, then no unemployment makes sense. But let's say they've exhausted that, then, and this is typically for maybe for larger companies that are not are exempt, over the 500, I've heard this from. If they're quarantined and they're not sick, then potentially they could claim unemployment. I just say if you're interested, file, just be honest about the answers, and call them if you're unsure, because I will tell you this, the government will be sure to turn around, even though it's unclear, they'll hold the employee liable and make the employee repay if they dish out employment benefits when they weren't entitled to it. I've had a couple cases where I've seen that already. Do I, but if they're sick, if they're actually sick with COVID, they're probably not going to qualify for unemployment, because part of qualifying for unemployment is that you were able to work. And if you're sick, you fail that criteria because you're unable to work. Do I use this against their existing vacation PTO? You have to handle sick pay first. So if they're sick or quarantined, you can't take away their PTO or their vacation time, whatever benefits they had. This overrides it, and they still get to keep that PTO and vacation or whatever they've accrued so far. So if they're, and again, this is articulate to COVID. If they're just sick in general and they weren't tested, or let's say they need to take off and there's no quarantine, then you default to the normal PTO vacation policy. But if there's COVID involved, or if there's a quarantine involved, then you have to default to this, to the FFCRA Sick Pay Act here. Can I force them to use them for PTO first? For the paid sick leave, no. For the Medical Leave Act, and this is kind of really more so towards the, towards the daycare closures and school closures, potentially yes. So I say potentially, and because there's a lot of nuance with there, because they can supplement it, because you're only getting 2/3, they can potentially supplement it with vacation, so they can get still a full check. It's kind of analogous to what I would call, when let's say mom gives birth and she's out on disability, and she can supplement a little bit for disability with vacation time, etc. But it's not very. I haven't come across that personally yet, because we're just now. Schools are open virtually, and so that's kind of a different story. And I haven't seen a ton of school or daycare closures since April, May, and June. So can my employee supplement with PTO? Yes, they can, especially if they're running out of the sick pay. Here's one. What if I don't have a written PTO policy? Get one. I can't tell you, not just for COVID here, that this is a huge issue where people have kind of just done verbal vacation or PTO, and it backfires, easily on the back end. So you really want to tell like when can you use it, managers approval is required, if they are allowed to be paid out PTO if they quit or get fired or terminated. So you want, when do they accrue it? So those kind of typical things, because that can lead to a whole world of problems if you don't have a written sick pay or sick scheduling or PTO policy. So if you don't have one, get one, especially if anything's incentivizing you now, now's the time. When do I get my tax credits? If it's running through payroll, you get it in one of two ways. You can either reduce the federal tax deposit that you pay monthly or semi-weekly to the IRS, by the sick pay amount that's qualified. And if you're using QuickBooks, you actually have to code it separately in QuickBooks or your payroll program as COVID pay in order for it to know that to apply these credits. That's very important, that your accounting system that you're using has to know to do this. And then when do I get my tax credits? You can also get it as a refund when you file your 941. It's also available. So speaking of which, if you did end up paying someone sick pay while they were sick and did not realize this was a thing, you can potentially file an amended payroll tax form and claim the credit and get a refund. That is on the table. You can also, another thing too is if you're self-employed, you get your tax credit on your Form 1040 when you file. So if we or Gail is doing your payroll, please notify us and provide us the documents for the COVID-related sick pay, because we need that and need the days, please provide that to us if we are handling or if Dale is handling your payroll. It's very important that we have that, because otherwise that could easily be missed then if it's not, because because we obviously can't, we're not there day to day managing with you, so we wouldn't be able to know until you tell us. What if my employee is confrontational? Well, I mean, that depends. I mean, why they're getting confrontational, because, if they're feeling accused or like they're lying. But as long as you're kind about it and respectful, there shouldn't be any confrontational issue. It's just a matter of documentation. And if they're getting confrontational about that, that usually is a red flag to me that there's, that maybe there's someone being disingenuous. So, so as long as you're, respectful and just focus on the facts, not accusing or implying accusation, there shouldn't be any confrontational issue about this. Now, great question is, what if they can telework? If they can telework and you want them to telework, you're allowed to ask them to telework. So, so if they're quarantined and they can telework, then you fall under the teleworking policies, and they work and do their, and they're not technically subject to the sick pay if they can provide services while they're teleworking. In fact, my own mother-in-law, she had COVID, and she worked for a large company, and they said, yeah, we still want you to work even though you're sick. How's your symptoms? Good enough to work. All right, you're working. And they wanted her to telework so many hours during the week. She did not get all the sick pay. Now that's a little bit pushy there, and I kind of wonder if that's in fact entirely legal. But if they're, let's say, not sick and they're quarantined, then by all means you can ask them to telework if you have a teleworking policy. And then they're not, or if let's say they can only telework 10 hours a week or 20 out of 40 because they're home, then they would have 10 to 20 hours of teleworking, and then the rest could be sick pay potentially. Again, it does not need to be in the same 2-week period, and that's been on the DOL FAQs for Department of Labor. Very large FAQ, I might add. So with that kind of wraps up. I like to keep punctual here. That wraps up our little 30 minutes here. Does anyone have any questions? You want to interject, ask anything there? It's kind of a first time that we're doing this. I love the feedback, because with all this uncertainty going on, we feel that there's so many clients that can benefit from things like this, just kind of keeping people up to date in what we're seeing and what people are asking about.
Hey, Gennaro, this is Angel. First of all, thank you for having this. It was super informational. It actually answered some additional questions that I've had back in my mind. Not that our office has a lot of issues. We do a lot of telework here. So if people need to quarantine, and thankfully no one's actually been sick. So a lot of these things we haven't had to utilize, but I know a lot of local businesses that have. So first of all, thank you for having this session. Secondly, I have a question about, for employers that have over 500 employees, essentially. So we have a local company that has, way more than 500 employees. And I've heard some situations happening where they essentially, an individual has used the COVID time, right? Because they were told by the health department to quarantine, or by a doctor because their child was sick or they were sick. They exhausted that time just because, with a baby, they get sick often, and their rules say if you're sick, you have to stay home. So then that individual not only exhausted that, but they exhausted their leftover PTO. So with that being said, what happens to those individuals that, they don't have any more time, but they're sick and technically they're not supposed to work, or their daycare provider becomes ill and tests positive for COVID and they can't find a sitter? What happens in that gray area when there's just no more time left? What happens, or in your experience, what's the best direction that way?
Yeah, that's a great point, great question. First off, thanks for the accolades. With the over 500, the issue there is that if you have over 500 employees, you're actually exempt from required to be offered sick pay here. So if you're exempt from that, then technically you have to, if you're exempt from that, then you have to then the employers can pretty much have a little free reign there. So the issue there is that if they're completely out, then you have to almost default back to the regular FMLA if they qualify there, which means that it's unpaid. And, in the FMLA, just effectively in a nutshell, just protects their job for the when they get back. And, so I'm not, so as far as the regular FMLA, I know there's certain criteria there, and oftentimes being sick in general might not cut it. So unfortunately, essentially in my mind, that's a little bit of a gap there where some people might be exposed to, being unpaid or even potentially losing their job because of this if they're working for someone over 500.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
And then can you just touch on briefly, what about those that are, that aren't exempt, right? The ones that are under the 500 but over the 50. What happens in, so same question, but what happens for those that aren't exempt then?
So for those that aren't exempt, so first off, after they've exhausted their PTO, and all that, then it switches over a few slides back. It would switch over to what's called the, under this, see on the very bottom here on the slide, the 10 weeks and 12 weeks protected. They would fall under that essentially, because essentially it's the expanded FMLA. They stopped the expanded sick pay is over, and now we're on the expanded FMLA, in which case that they can still run up to the 10 or now 12 weeks where they get some protection there. After that, the law just simply doesn't provide any further protection after that. I think when they structured this law, they were anticipating that truly it would be over in 2020 at some point. And now that we're seeing that it's still going strong, they're probably going to have to do a few more adjustments to this law in order for it, because it's going to carry into 2021.
Great. Thank you for that information.
Absolutely. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. Anyone else? So great question. Do the 80 hours reset in 2021? I was hoping someone might ask that. And the answer is no. And the reason being is that this is all technically done at the end of 2020. Because again, when they made this law, they were probably not anticipating this to bleed into 2021. So my gut is that after the dust settles with, with the elections, that whatever stimulus, if any, that they pass, and that they're probably going to include some provision to potentially extend these. So stay tuned on that.
All right.
Well, that's it. So I appreciate you all joining me here for a lovely little Friday. I actually, I'm actually going to, I found a way to actually record this. So, so if you know anyone that wasn't able to make it, I'm more than happy to share. Now I just kind of have to, figure out how to save it now. So it should be saved. And I say should because I have not recorded on the Zoom before, but I did hit the record button. So it was lovely having you all for a Friday afternoon. You have a happy, good weekend. And if we get enough, to do this again, probably in like a few weeks, I'll send out another email. We do these like the MailChimps. We do send out, like if I'm going to do that, I'll have something in there. I'll send out like another black email saying, hey, would you be interested in doing this? So, any case, great to have you aboard, and have a wonderful weekend.